Nice to see you. Can you hear me? Okay, so probably let's start 2 minutes earlier. So hopefully everybody has joined. Okay, so distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this book launch of the book Informal Services in Asian Cities, Lessons for Urban Planning and Management from the COVID-19 Pandemic. And thank you very much for joining this event. And we also have side events after the panel discussion, after the book launch ceremony. So my name is Lei Song. I'm from Asian Development Bank, and I'm from the research department. We are handling producing this book, and the book is co-edited by Park Bamban, sitting here, and also Professor Ashok Das from University of Hawaii. And we have authors from the ADB Institute, as well as universities, academia, and other research institutions. So this book would be maybe one of the first discussing the informal services, and it's very fitting to launch this book at the sideline of the World Planning Schools Congress. And we have many planning schools joining this event. Thank you very much for joining. And so let's start with our chief economist. Yeah, he's joining virtually on the screen. So Professor Albert Park, and he is going to give welcome remarks to this event. So Albert, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Lele. Can you hear me all right?
Hang on, Chief Economist, we're making louder.
Okay.
Try again.
Can you hear me fine now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. So to ADB's former Vice President for Knowledge Management, Bambang Susantono, now Chairman of the new Capital City Authority of Indonesia, to our distinguished provincial and local government officials from Bali and other cities in Indonesia, to all of the distinguished guests and participants and speakers, to Asian Development Bank and ADBI colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'd like to warmly welcome you to this event, launching a joint ADB and ADBI book titled Informal Services in Asian Cities, Lessons for Urban Planning and Management from the COVID-19 Pandemic. As Lele just mentioned, the book is co-edited by our very own former Vice President for Knowledge Management at ADB, Pak Bambang Susantono, together with Professor Ashok Das of the University of Hawaii. I should say I feel particularly close to Bambang because he hired me to be the chief economist of the ADB, for which I will forever be in his debt. This book was conceptualized and produced during a global health crisis and provides lessons learned from one of the most challenging times for humanity. It's published at a time when Indonesia is planning a momentous historical event, the transfer of its capital city from Jakarta to Nusantara. The 11 chapters of the book were developed to be forward-looking so that they can both help old cities prepare for the worst and assist new cities to avoid the worst. What does the book tell us about informality, and how can we use this knowledge to improve our future? Let me begin with the simple conclusion first. We need to start thinking of informality as part of the solution rather than as part of the problem. And the good news is that we know there are policy instruments that can make this possible. We just need to think creatively and outside the box. So let me give you one example from the book. The book shows that in cities that have organically developed over time, like Jakarta or Bali, informal settlers and informal activities have become an enduring part of society. Informal workers and populations live in slums and other dwellings that are located over water, on the water, in the lowlands, in the highlands, and in disaster-prone areas. They also tend to congregate near cities where land is very valuable, and so unfortunately may crowd out more productive uses of the land. However, it also turns out that informal workers are often providers of key water and sanitation services that private and public formal entities won't or can't do, especially when confronted by external challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Their activities include delivering water tanks and bottled water, providing and maintaining community latrines, and so on. They are not authorized, supervised, or even acknowledged by formal authorities as part of the official system of public service provision. The book provides evidence of the innovation and resilience of informal enterprises and their critical role in serving as a bridge between formal services and customers and citizens. Using them as intermediaries offers benefits not only for efficient service delivery, but also in terms of social and gender equity gains. The new Capital City Authority is in very good hands under the leadership of Pak Bambang Susantono. I hope that the lessons in this book will be useful in planning not only Nusantara, but also other cities around the world. So let me just close by, again, congratulating Chairman Bambang, Ashok, and the ADB team for this very timely and useful knowledge product. Also, congratulations to the WPSC and APSA for a successful 2022 conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert. So after Albert welcome remarks, we also have our Dean and the CEO of ADB Institute from Tokyo, Tatsushi Sonobe. But unfortunately, he couldn't join because of his busy schedule supporting G20. G20 is also here in Bali, but he's not here. Yeah, we are supporting ADB and ADB are supporting G20 in terms of think tanks. So he gave us already a pre-recorded message. So could you please play Dean Sonobe's message? Thank you.
His Excellency Dr. Bambang Susantono, Chairman of the New Capital City Authority of Indonesia and former ADB Vice President for Knowledge Management, distinguished Indonesian government officials, distinguished guests and speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of the Asian Development Bank Institute, it's an honor and a pleasure to be part of the 5th World Planning Schools Congress and the 16th Asian Planning Schools Association Congress in Bali, Indonesia, to present the book titled Informal Services in Asian Cities, Lessons for Urban Planning and Management from COVID-19 Pandemic, and to host a side event to disseminate ADB's and ADBI's experiences and lessons on the topic. Asia's economic development and rapid urbanization have reduced poverty in the region significantly. The informal economy was previously viewed as a transitory phenomenon that would eventually be absorbed by the modernization of the urban industrial sector in the process of economic development. However, this has not been the case. The informal economy continues to grow as more people migrate from rural areas to urban centers in the hope of finding more promising jobs and better economic opportunities by pursuing precarious livelihoods in the informal sector. Slums, as one of the faces of informality, are often characterized by small or undefined workplaces, unsafe and unhealthy working conditions, low skill and productivity levels, low or irregular incomes, long working hours, and lack of access to information, markets, finance, training, and technology. Workers are often not recognized, registered, regulated, or protected by any labor law or social protection. Some of the causes of informality include low levels of education, discrimination, poverty, and lack of access to economic resources and markets. The spontaneous growth of the informal sector posed a major challenge, particularly to workers' rights and their access to decent working conditions, which in turn negatively affected businesses, public revenues, government room for maneuver, institutional soundness, and fair competition. Not surprisingly, the informal sector was the hardest hit by the pandemic. The outbreak of COVID-19 led to the collapse of meager healthcare systems and increased poverty through widespread job and income losses. The impact of lockdown and decline in economic activity had severely affected 47% of the 2 billion people who depend on informal sector. The pandemic has demonstrated that inclusive urban planning must give due consideration to the informal sector, whether in the provision of basic water and sanitation services or in the promotion of jobs and livelihoods through small and medium enterprises. Traditional methods of policy and planning may need to be reconfigured to create space for innovation in project design, capacity building, and community participation, and more generally, innovation in ways that can transform the informal sector from mere bystanders of development to co-creators of the urban future. To continue working for a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific, ADB and ADBI should not ignore the challenge of informality. We hope that various lessons from this book will not only guide urban planning, but also help ensure that the informal sector is recognized as an indispensable partner for development in the region and beyond. To Chairman Bamban Santono, Professor Ashok Das, and the ADB-ADBI team who brought this book to light, please accept my heartfelt congratulations. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dean Sonobe-san. And now, we'd like to invite Chairman Park Bamban Susantono to give us the ideas and the concepts behind the book. So before giving you give the speech, let me briefly introduce you. Although you probably don't need an introduction, but for the audience, Dr. Susantono, I think by training you were an engineer and also infrastructure planning, so that's very fitting. So before you joined the ADB, you were a deputy minister. I remember you are deputy minister of transportation in the Indonesian government, and also at one stage you were the acting minister. Then you joined the ADB. So Dr. Susantono joined the ADB, I remember in the middle of 2015. Yeah, I was in the office of the president as a senior advisor to the president. So actually we welcomed the joining of Dr. Susantono because he brought his rich experience in infrastructure planning. And probably, you know, ADB is a mostly infrastructure bank. And he also brought the rich experience from the government. Yeah, he was a deputy minister. So the ADB has benefited significantly from Park Bamban's contribution. And Park Bamban stayed in ADB until this March, this year. Yeah, we had farewell, virtual farewell to you. Yeah, I was in the research department under his management. He was, during the 7 years he was in ADB, he was our vice president for knowledge management. So that's a very important position because knowledge management, ADB claims we are the knowledge bank, but actually knowledge side, we didn't do very well. And we invest a lot of infrastructure, but under his leadership, knowledge management within ADB has improved significantly. And then we can claim now, ADB is a knowledge bank, and we provide the knowledge solutions to developing Asia, and we help countries to develop. And so now he's the chairman. I think it's already everybody knows he's the chairman of the new capital city of Indonesia, Nusantara Capital City Authority. And so, Chairman Park Bamban.
Thank you very much, Dr. Song, distinguished guests, chief economists from Manila, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. A very good day from Bali, Indonesia, for those of you who are joining online. It is my great pleasure to be here with all of you to launch these publications, this book on informal services in Asian cities. I believe that the literatures and studies on these informal services are very scarce, right? That is why At the first place, we think about doing more research in this area because we want to know more, we want to understand more, and we want to try to do our best in trying to deal with the informality, especially in urban area. So let me first convey my gratitude to ADB and ADBI for all the assistance and for the co-publisher and co-organizers. I would like to thank also to the World Planning School Congress for organizing this event together with us. I'd like to start by expressing also my sincere appreciations to my co-editor, Professor Ashok Das, and also all the participants and all the authors of the chapters in the book. I believe they can testify that putting this book together during a global health crisis is really a great challenge. Nevertheless, the team fought on, and because we believe in the timeliness and the importance of the message we want to put forward. And here we are with the book this afternoon. Right? So let me now share 3 observations that I made in the book. First, we observe that despite the Asia impressive poverty reduction in recent decades, urban inequality has grown and remains a concern. The informal sector has strived to provide essential livelihood options to urban poor in most of the developing world. But as we are all aware, it is by virtue of them being informal that renders them vulnerable to multiple threats. Second, those in the urban informal sector, deprived of basic services and social protections, suffered disproportionately during the COVID-19 pandemic. And third, we observe that planning scholarship has been calling for urban planning and governance to be inclusive of informality. Yet, planning practice has been slow and sporadic in responding to these unprecedented circumstances. So, in this book, we urge a call to actions about the prevalence, value, and vulnerability of the informal sector. We further encourage governments, development institutions, and civil society to concentrate their efforts on serving the needs of this urban informal sector and monitoring recovery responses. We contribute to serving the critical need for urban planners and policymakers, as well as other stakeholders, to acknowledge and engage with the urban informal sector proactively and effectively. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, how did we achieve this? In the book, we explored urban informality in multiple contexts of Indonesia and several other countries, including Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, and also the Philippines. Drawing upon qualitative research, the book also includes topics on food security, water, sanitation, and housing, all highlighting the interconnectedness of multiple capability deprivations and also risk. The book also illustrates how informal sector provides could be essential and formal intermediaries in providing urban services. It also offers interesting novel insights into the intersections of informality and the pandemic with the digital technology and gender aspect. The book asserts the need to avoid the tendency to locate informality solely within individual sectors. It reinforces an emerging realization in planning research that for urban policy and planning to be effective, the current fragmented treatment of informality must end. Through this book, all the authors and editor stress the need for actions and coordinations across cities and regions. We also encourage for multidisciplinary understanding and multi-stakeholder responses that are context-specific, especially with active participations by those living in the informal sector. Altogether, we emphasize that informality goes beyond sectors, goes beyond scales, and goes beyond actors. That equating informality solely with urban poverty or illegality is problematic, and that digital technologies can empower the informal sector and enable formal planning to engage constructively with it. So I do hope that the book will be a source of knowledge for development practitioners in Asia, Pacific, and also around the world to expand and to improve the understanding of this very important informal sector. I do hope that the book will motivate city authorities to be more proactive in being inclusive of informality, which is necessary to unleash the informal sector's potential to realize transformative urban planning and governance. So before I close, let me again invite the team that behind the book, which is attending in person. First, Dr. Lele Song. Please have a round of applause to him also. On my right is Amy. Actually, Amy has been twice with me in launching the book. I was with her in Baku, Azerbaijan, in also launching my book in infrastructure financing. Yeah, so this is second time. I would like also to thanks to Jindra. Where is Jindra? Hi, Jindra. Thank you. And to Regina and Andaru from WPSC. They are outside there. Hi there. And also Andrew from my office here. Yeah, see? So thank you again, and I look forward to the discussion, and also look forward to have a more sort of like research perhaps in this area in the future. Thank you and enjoy the discussion. Back to you, Lele.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Bambang. And before we start the panel discussion, we have a short book launch ceremony. So I hand over to Amy,
Thank you very
moderator the
much.
ceremony.
Thank you very much, Lele. My name is Amy Humble. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm an economist at the Asian Development Bank, and it is a pleasure for me to be here, as well as support Pak Bambang in the second book, our second book together. So I would like to request Professor Ashok Das to please stand in front on the right side, and Chairman Bambang Susantono to be on his side as we proceed with the book handover ceremony. So Ashok, please go here on the right. And Chairman Bambang, please go here on Ashok's left. And I will be calling the names of people, persons, important persons that we would like to turn over the book. Okay. Starting with the President of Indonesian Planning Schools Association, Professor Ivan Rodiarto, please. Thank you very much. Thank you. The Secretary of the Transition Team of Ibu Kota Negara, Professor Jaka Santos. Please stay there, yes, and then move aside, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The President of the Global Planning Education Association Network, Professor Eduardo C. Nobre. Thank you very much. The President of the Asian Planning School Association, Professor Yang Sung Lee. Thank you very much, sir. And the Director of the Economic Analysis and Operational Support Division of Asian Development Bank, Dr. Lele Song. Thank you very much. Please take your seats, gentlemen. Thank you very much. We have another round. Please stay, Ashok and Pak Bambang. Thank you, gentlemen. From Universitas Mula Varman, Professor Mas Jaya, Rector. Thank you very much. The Rector of the Universitas Balikpapan, Dr. Isradi Zainal. Thank you very much. The Chancellor of Universitas Juanda, Chancellor H. Martin Rostami. Thank you very much. The head of the Department of Urban Planning of the Universitas Diponegoro, Professor Ridwandari Andiano. Thank you very much. From the Department of Urban Planning, Professor of the Universitas Gajah Mada, Professor Bakti Setiawan. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you very much. We would like to call on for a special handover ceremony Madam Lucy Susantono for her unwavering support to Chairman Bambang Susantono during his career and in the publication of this book. Madam Lucy, please. Thank you very much. And we would also like to call on Professor Priyam Das, who was also instrumental in the publication of this book. Thank you very much. Please take your seat. I would like to remind everybody that the book is available at the ADB booth after this ceremony. Please take books with you, and if you feel like not taking the heavy book, we also have the QR code in the flyer that you have on your chairs. And we are also live being beamed as we speak right now in YouTube. So, all right. So now I'd like to proceed with our side event, which is just a brief discussion on the contents of the book so that we will be informed about it. I would like to request co-editor Professor Ashok Das to provide us with a brief outline of the book. Ashok, thank you.
I can just. All right. But we could have the table of contents. I could show them if they want. Yeah. Oh, okay. Actually, I'll also just stand. Maybe it's easier. I can look at the thing. Okay. Can also. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to this event. As Bambang, as Amy, as Lele have already explained and described, it was quite a difficult process to put this together because our authors and contributors and the team that helped us produce the book, I mean, were spread across multiple continents. And so as you can imagine, it all happened during COVID. So I personally want to congratulate not just the authors, but especially the team behind the scenes, because they worked so hard. And I think if it was not for them, then we would not have been able to keep it on schedule as Bambang had wanted this to be. So my personal congratulations to the team before I go. So it's just a little bit about what the book contains, right? So next slide, please. Yeah. So we wanted this to sort of, I mean, in my earliest discussions with Bambang, we thought, what should we really focus on in this book? And we were of the consensus, as Bambang mentioned, that informality informality is a reality and we have to face it every day. Yet our understanding, I mean, our meaning people who are in the business of planning and governance and development, is still kind of very inadequate or partial and sometimes confounding. So, and we also didn't know exactly what was happening because of COVID. We were lucky to have contributors in this book who were actually working on these issues either before or had just started to look at issues during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we capitalized on that. So like despite impressive poverty reduction, particularly in Asia, poverty actually has become more urban and there is also growing inequality. And this is not just true of Asia, but everywhere, but Asia is especially pronounced in Asian cities. And COVID-19, I mean, as destructive as it has been, it did inadvertently a boon. I mean, it was a boon in the sense that it helped people understand and it exposed the expansiveness and pervasiveness of the informal sector. And also brought to fore the vulnerabilities that people face on a daily basis. So we wanted this book to sort of help stakeholders, all stakeholders involved in sort of urban planning and development, appreciate the urgency for app data. There are very, I mean, the data on the informal sector is extremely hard to come by and extremely inadequate and extremely unreliable, if at all it exists. And so the policies that are therefore, I mean, created to deal with the informal sector are obviously inadequate. So the Asian Development Bank is keen to assist. I mean, and in its strategy 2030, it envisions more livable, resilient, and inclusive, right? I mean, cities. So that was kind of also the framework with which we wanted to work. And especially given climate climate change at the scale and pace it is happening, and the implications of that, this was very important for us to also sort of focus in the book. Next slide, please. So the contributors are their researchers at the Asian Development Bank, at the Asian Development Bank Institute, as well as practitioners and researchers at other development institutions, as well as academic scholars. And they represent a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds, which gives this, I think, book and its chapters a very sort of a comprehensive, flavor. They also represent very distinct research designs and methodologies. And here I want to make a note, particularly that not only is it difficult for quantitative researchers to work, but I think for the qualitative researchers who were doing their work during the pandemic, it was even more difficult because there was absolutely no access. So the innovation and the creativity that the contributors have demonstrated in order to produce this research is quite actually commendable. Of course, because of the same reasons, you might find, I mean, that there are shortcomings probably because just it was difficult to access, I mean, and it was risky also, I mean, in doing so. So, but nevertheless, I think, it in itself shows that despite challenges, there are ways to get around, you know, so in a way it's related to the bigger theme of dealing with informality. And specifically what we have done is that we focused on some select physical infrastructure and services, but also like interesting financial and human development services, which are being sort of where the potential, to sort of enhance them exists because of the digitalization. And then we also wanted to illuminate how informality operates within some key urban sectors. And we wanted to eventually sort of focus on how do we use this knowledge? You know, we have the knowledge, we know why it should be done, but how do we do it? So we wanted to emphasize the how. How should institutions work? How should institutions work together? And so on and so forth. The process ideas, to the extent possible, were some things that we wanted all the authors to contribute. And finally, it, as Pa Bambang also mentioned, that it is very important. I mean, it taught us all that all these problems are interrelated. So you cannot treat and should not treat sectors as, I mean, we need to focus on sectors, but at the same time, the very siloed sort of, status quo needs to change. So thank you. So next, yeah. So anyway, I won't read this all, but what I wanted to show, there are 11 chapters in the book. So the chapters from 2 through 3, which are like the first one is by Virender Sharma and Joy Bailey. The next one, that's overall giving multidimensional sort of poverty insights into the multidimensional poverty framework and how it can be used. Then specifically by Joris van Etten and Tiffany Chan, the policies and programs regarding slum upgrading and housing in Indonesia. Then on enabling resilience, basic services, and how these things intersect with sort of climate change, etc., by Priyam Das, Lakshya Sherpa, and myself. And then we were very excited to have this chapter, which was rarely discussed in sort of urban planning issues, is food security. So this was we focused on the food security issue of informal sector people in Dhaka. And this was very interesting research. I mean, and this was hard to do also. So this was by John Taylor and Janet Nako, Saiful Momen, and myself. Then there was a group led by Penny Dutton, Isabel Blackett, Nita Pokhrel, Lara Arjun, Christian Waldo, and Ellen Pascua, which looked at very interesting innovations that are happening with intermediaries in water and sanitation sector services. The chapters on this side that you see are chapters. So on the left side, those chapters that I just mentioned to you are mostly qualitative and mixed methods research, predominantly qualitative. These ones worked with our quantitative chapters, working with various kinds of data sets from collected very locally as well as national level data sets. But again, because of the fact that it's very hard to distinguish what is informal and what is formal in data sets, I think the ingenuity sort of demonstrated in sort of working with the data was particularly impressive. So we have a chapter on Cambodia led by Dil Rahut and Jitendra Prakash, Fanarot Chai, and Peter Morgan, which looks at small and micro enterprises with a gender perspective in Cambodia. Another one on micro, small, and medium industry size enterprises and digitalization. And this is particularly focused in Indonesia by Shigehiro Shinozaki. Then this is chapter which looked at fintech, financial technology services, and how it combines with state aid, etc., for informal household business. And this is a comparative chapter across multiple countries by Peter Morgan, Kun Hu Kim, and Long Chi Chin. And then chapter 10 was about looking at the health aspects also of informal sector. So digitalization, health, as well as tricycle drivers in sort of in the Philippines. And this was by Takashi Yamano, Yasuki Sawada, Shigehiro Shinozaki, Hyunchul, Brian Kim, and Singju Choi, and Siho Park. So, and based on all of this, I mean, we sort of wrote the introduction and concluding chapters. So it was a very, very, exciting and challenging, 1 year for us, because like I said, there were many different moving parts, etc. But I really, this would not have been possible without the, contributions of the, authors, whom we subjected to pretty strict deadlines at times, and also the unwavering support of the support team. I can't emphasize that more, so this is really, congratulations to them also. So thank you. Do we have one more slide, I think? Yeah, sorry. So I already mentioned this, so I'm not going to belabor on this too much. So like I said, there are many interesting ideas, innovations we notice. They already exist. So that's the what can be done kind of question. The understanding in terms of theory and sort of education, etc., needs to be improved in terms of why this is important, right? So not just sort of a unidimensional or a single disciplinary perspective, but from the multidisciplinary perspective. But much more emphasis needs, both in terms of process, in terms of research as well as practice, on how this can be done better. So we know the what's and the whys, but we really need to improve our understanding of how to do this. And this is about the relationships between different stakeholders, institutions at different scales, etc. And to do all of this, we realize that planning education must improve, right? It has to, there has to be an improvement in supply, just the volume of planning schools, for example, the quality, interdisciplinarity, the contextuality, and also education that is experiential, so that people understand this by doing, by seeing, and by experiencing while they're, as students, and also very reflexive. But more importantly, we realize that many other disciplines influence what actually happens in terms of urban planning and policy. And they also need to, engage more interdisciplinarily. And that, I think, is a key message that I think is unique to this book. And So in order to do that, again, education is not only the, I think, the bastion of, say, the government or private sector or universities, but actually civil society actors can also work in providing better education. So all these institutions need to work together in interesting ways, and it'll particularly help, I mean, the co-production, innovation, data generation, as well as mobilization of communities better. So in all of this, there are various engagement possibilities for the ADB and similar institutions to go more local, as well as sort of focus, I mean, to focus on developing institutional capacities, again, data, public goods, often of different kinds, new kinds, as well as, I mean, all of this can be supported probably better, made possible because of the advancement in digitalization in those technologies. So thank you. I'll end with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ashok Das. So you mentioned that one of the chapters in the book is about Indonesia from Juris Van Etten and Tiffany Tran. So I would like to call Juris in front to please give us an overview of your chapter. Thank you.
I guess I was standing here. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Selamat siang. I'm a bit nervous to present this chapter because if I look around the room, there's so much knowledge here. So who am I as a still relatively young at heart gentleman to present about policies which Indonesia has applied for improving housing and informal settlements. But my connection with Indonesia and informal settlements goes back to my as-do-I work at ITB, actually, when we looked at public-private community partnerships for housing informal settlements or improvement of housing of informal settlements. So actually the research which Pak Bambang encouraged us to undertake was a way back to reflect on, 20 years plus of experience. And next slides. So one of the topics which we have tapped on a couple of times already today is indeed the topic of multidimensional poverty. Next slide, please. And when you look at the overall, next please, when you look at the overall discussions around settlements, informal settlements, slum, as well as slum upgrading, I don't want to go into the detail, but of course, if you look at it from a perspective then from institution which I work for, which is the Asian Development Bank, is that we look oftentimes at the physical aspects, the improvement of water supply, sanitation, housing, and that's all very important. But one thing we wanted to highlight in the chapter is the additional elements which need to be considered. So next slide, please. So the key here is, of course, to understand the poverty elements. Next slide. And for that, we had this reference framework that if you look at some of the indicators for poverty, actually, if you look at this, that you have the health, education, and living standards. And normally we are looking at, as I said, as a development bank, at sanitation, drinking water, housing. Of course, there's an aspect also that we sometimes our development member countries ask us to contribute to educational aspects. But to broaden that scope, to broaden that understanding was very important for us. So next slide, please. If you look at these aspects and the challenges which urban poor face, whether it's higher cost of living, the fear of evictions, disasters, overcrowding, livelihoods, remittances and the fluctuations around that, food security, how can you best design a program of responsiveness to that? And of course, Indonesia has a very strong tradition in through its kampung improvement projects, through its projects related to also looking at some of the social aspects of poverty. Please, next slide. And so there are a couple of elements when we broke it down and thought about, because that's the beauty, of course, of working on a book like this, is to provide yourself a mirror and you say, okay, these are the programs I'm working on a day-to-day basis, but are they actually reaching the goals that we want to reach? Are we actually able to address the aspects that we want to address? So in order to look at poverty There's the monetary challenge of not having access to cash, of course. Another element which we really were keen to explore was this topic around the physical and the mental health and what it does to children, for example, to be poor and malnourished and their educational performance. And then, of course, to look at the ability, for example, to provide savings. I'm going through this in quite a rush, because I don't want to take up too much time, but B, also to encourage you, of course, to read the chapter and this just as an enticement. So let's go to the next slide here. What we saw and when we wrote the chapter, the key elements was that we don't really know often that multidimensional challenges of poverty. We are quite well in counting, access to water, access to sanitation, but when it comes down to the health impacts, the economic impacts, the mental impacts of poverty, we actually don't have that much data. As a result, also, it's difficult for us to measure impact of the work we do. And one of the key challenges is for a multidimensional approach to poverty, you also need vertical and horizontal integration. And the way of that we work as an Asian Development Bank, we provide a loan which goes to a particular ministry, and that ministry has a particular mandate. And it's not always easy then for that ministry to collaborate with other ministries, other line ministries. That's why it's so important also to work at the scale of cities, because that's where that horizontal integration takes place under the leadership of a mayor. Next slide, please. So the key of the chapter is actually looking at 3 recently completed pieces of work which we've done with the support from the Asian Development Bank in Indonesia. Next slide, please. The first one is our neighborhood upgrading and shelter project, which ran from 2014 till 2019 and looked at provided support, financial support for slum upgrading, both on-site as well as off-site, which included a bit of resettlement actually in 20 cities. The picture you see here is actually from Palopo, where indeed we were able to, through a very careful process, take people from areas which were very much affected by flooding, poor living circumstances, and assist them to move into better housing provisions. Now, the first thing, of course, we always try to do is on-site improvement, but this was actually quite a successful example of how resettlement actually was able to support poor families, as long as it's done on the right location with the right economic aspects around it. Next slide, please. So there were quite substantial reduction in the cities that we worked in, reduction of slum areas. And of course, you have the environmental sustainable growth areas, the inclusive economy. So, for example, we look very clearly at the decreased cost of transport. And we also noted around areas of gender involvement, women involvement in construction. And next slide, please. So this is a picture again of the situation before, the area where the people were resettled from in Palopo to the new site development. Thanks. Next slide. Another project which also Pak Bambang has been very closely involved in is the revitalization of informal settlements project and environments, which is piloted both in Fiji, Suva, Fiji, as well as in Makassar, Indonesia. And there we are applying a water-sensitive approach. And I understand that actually some colleagues in the room here also are very excited about that water-sensitive approach, because it provides building with nature, which at the same time, the additional benefit is that it creates a very nice environment. Next slide, please. The approach was really to look at a random. It's actually really a research project where you look at how does the application of a water-sensitive approach actually in the end not only have benefits to the environment, but also health benefits to the citizens living in those areas. So by working together with Monash University, actually you are seeing indeed what is the impact of improved access to sanitation on the well-being and the health and mental and physical well-being of citizens living in those areas. Next slide, please. And this is, we were lucky to do one pilot with the intention to scale that up. That scaling up is now financed by the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade, and to an additional 6 settlements in Makassar. But this is a picture of the pilot area where you see how previously access was impossible for example, these sellers. And now you have an opportunity for people living in those areas to actively participate in the economic development. So not only are you investing in infrastructure, but you're also investing in economic development. Thank you very much. Next slide. The last project we looked at was this Livable Settlements Investment Project, which was in preparation of a loan which the government of Indonesia was keen to take, but hasn't materialized yet, which is where we were looking at livability profiles as a tool to understand those cities. And we've done that now so far for Cirebon, Makassar, Pontianak, and Semarang. And basically what you do is, rather than studying a lot of documents, actually you're going to ask people around town. Of course, you make sure that it's a representative target group, and you really appreciate and understand from their inputs what are the key priorities they would like to have the city focus on. So these livability profiles allow us to really understand the challenges and opportunities from the perspective of citizens. Next slide, please. So it's a need to survey, to map that, to properly put that on the map, to analyze, capacitate, and innovate. So appreciate how to, for example, use local researchers to carry out this work. And for us, it's really, particularly during COVID, a wonderful way to understand the dynamics of a city. Thanks. And the key framework we used for analysis was this framework of human capital, built capital, social capital, natural capital. And again, you can read more about it within the book. But this provides lenses to try and understand the key challenges and opportunities. And so the surveys with citizens was also structured around that same 4 pillars of capital. Next slide. So where does this lead us to? Because of course, I'm not a researcher in that sense. I'm a project officer who has to deliver on projects. And I just lift out one key lesson from the work, which I also think is a key opportunity given that we are, and that's the next slide, is that we have now so much additional access to information. So creatively using that technology, which is already out there, to understand these dynamics of poverty. So, for example, here we are, these are maps from Cirebon, where we are using a platform developed by the Future Cities Lab in Singapore to map, for example, the linkages of how far a park is compared to where the slum areas are. So how far do people from informal settlements have to walk to go to a green open space, or to look at and access to a traditional market. So you can try to, once you have all this data, you can overlay this wonderfully in that earthscape. Next slide, please. And you get then this kind of info maps and data. So I think while the challenges of poverty and informal settlements in Indonesia and the region are very multidimensional, we have now so many more tools in hand than what I had when I started back in '96, looking at informal settlements in Bandung. And I wish only that these data, they allow us not only to understand the cities and the informal settlements better, but also to make better decisions as to how to address these challenges. With that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yuris. I know we may have some questions, but I would just like to request everyone to please hold on to them. We will have a Q&A session after all the presentations where you will have the opportunity to ask your questions. So I'd like to call on our colleague, Christian Walder, who sent in a pre-recorded presentation on meeting the demand for water and sanitation services in Asia's informal urban areas.
A very good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to be with you today and to talk about the topic on meeting the demand for water and sanitation services in Asia's informal urban areas. This is part of the book chapter on lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic for urban planning and management. And I'm presenting our contribution on behalf of my co-authors, namely Penny Dutton, Isabel Blackett, Ms. Nita Pockrell, Lara Arjan, and Ms. Ellen Pasqua. My name is Christian Walder. I'm a water supply and sanitation specialist working with the Asian Development Bank's Water Sector Group. Before diving into the details and some of the findings and results of our study, I would like to start with a kind of overview about typical informal services along the sanitation service chain and also the water supply service chain. I think it is quite important to understand that informal services come in at different levels along the service chain, both for water supply and sanitation. So for example, when you think of sanitation, the containment, the informal building of latrines and septic tanks, but also the transport, the informal community sewers, or the transport of the fecal sludge to a facility or to a site where the fecal sludge is being disposed. But also for water supply, starting with the extraction, with informal services who are operating community boreholes or wells, or even for tanker operators, for bicycle vendors. So there are many interactions of informal services along the entire service chain, both for sanitation and water supply. And I think it's very important to understand that people living in informal settlements, obviously, they need to have access to water supply and sanitation services, and they're able to find their solutions, obviously. They are also able to find their solutions where the formal service providers are not in a position to provide the services to those regions. Obviously, where the formal service providers stop, informal service providers are coming in and finding creative ways to basically serve their clients in informal settlements. By taking one step back, I think it's very important to understand the barriers, both from the utility perspective and the user perspective. So starting with the utility barriers in terms of providing water and sanitation services to informal communities. And without going into the details of the points I've listed there, I just want to highlight a few. For example, a utility mandate to serve informal areas. Often formal utilities do not even have a mandate by the local authorities to serve informal areas. Then the specific site conditions, they can be very challenging. Densely unplanned areas, no treatment plants nearby, a lack of working experience in low-income areas, also conflict, violence, the safety of utility staff, a billing address where there is no billing address, where should the formal utility send their bills to? Concerns about increasing unfunded operation and maintenance costs. So from the utility perspective, there are a number of points and constraints why they are often not operating in informal areas. On the other hand, from the user perspective, people need to access water and sanitation services in informal communities, but sometimes they have no space to build a latrine. There is no service nearby. There is unclarity about the renting, about the house tenant, a lack of house or land tenure, or the landlord doesn't even have a permit. Sometimes, and we all know these cases from tanker operators, the charges are unaffordable, both for water supply and sewer. And the sewer connections are very high, monthly tariffs also for desludging charges. In informal areas, we often have dense housing without adequate access to lay pipes or to empty pits or tanks. And this comes with all the other technical challenges, such as high groundwater tables, rock and steep slopes. So there are a multitude of barriers and challenges, both from the utility perspective and the user perspective. And in the next slide, I would like to showcase some of the findings of our study. And I would like to highlight the importance of the intermediary model. So as part of our book chapter, we had a close look into 8 water supply and sanitation cases in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Nepal, and the Philippines. And we saw that intermediaries act as important links between formal utilities, SETIs, and customers to deliver sustainable water supply and sanitation services. We also saw, in particular during the COVID-19 pandemic, that those intermediaries have the ability to adapt quickly and to innovate when confronted by external challenges, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. On the right-hand side, I just want to showcase and emphasize one example from Bangladesh. You see on the top the formal utility and the city, which is the Chattogram Water and Sewerage Authority and City Corporation. Then you see the intermediary, the Shoba Jonapani, which is basically the organization, the social enterprise that is acting between the utility and the customers living in informal areas, because this intermediary is providing services to households and communities living in informal areas. Also quite important to emphasize that the SJP is being supported by an international NGO, by Water and Life, and I will emphasize the importance of having a parent organization later during this presentation. Just a number of photos so that you have a better impression how those social enterprises and NGOs are operating. So this is from the case study I've mentioned before in Bangladesh. You see, for example, the informal areas right next to the railway, and basically the social enterprise closely working together with the local communities in the picture on the bottom, also by building their capacity on the importance of safely managed water supply and sanitation services. You see in the picture at the top, it's very challenging to dig pipes to extend the network to the individual households. And in the picture on the bottom left, obviously you see, only can imagine how difficult it is to operate and maintain those systems in such a difficult environment. Another example from Nepal, you see Aerosan Enterprises operating community toilets that are very well maintained by the social enterprise, and the local communities, they really appreciate having these services to clean and safe water and sanitation services. With this slide, I would like to highlight some of the study findings and how to overcome the barriers to service delivery. Starting with formal relationships, we saw that memorandums of understanding with utility or local government, a business registration, or operating permits can really help to facilitate and to increase services to informal settlement. The capacity for scaling quality in order to provide clean, reliable, sustainable, and affordable services to the entire community. Talking about responsiveness and strong community relationship, to being adaptable to the needs of poor households, to changing environments such as the COVID-19 pandemic, but also having this long-term and deep community engagement and the community presence and the willingness to work with the local communities we saw was one of the very important points. And then, as I emphasized before, the benefits of a parent organization really can help to introduce into mainstream those services. For example, in the initial setup, in terms of financing some of the capital costs, doing capacity building, networking. As I said, many of those social enterprises were able to adapt quickly to changing environments. You see, for example, the mobile payment systems by Bumijo that has been introduced after the first lockdown. And with this, they were able to sustain their services even during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it is important to take those lessons for planners on board when doing water supply and sanitation projects. First and foremost, it's important to include informal settlements. Otherwise, residents will use low-quality informal service provider or self-provide. We need to plan models to fit water and sanitation utility mandates and service targets, and we need to discuss new ways how to deliver the water supply and sanitation services. We need to understand utilities' perspectives, but also highlight opportunities that are in for them. Another important point, what we saw in our case studies, was that poor customers, they are willing to pay, but the services need to be reliable. If there are clean services, if there are clean facilities, even poor people are willing to pay. We need to learn. We need to learn from each other. We need to learn from other countries, from other projects, and adapt those models to the local circumstances. And my last point, good planning includes serving informal areas and benefits the entire city. So really having this inclusive perspective when developing water supply and sanitation projects. I trust that some of those points might be useful for future projects. And I really would like to thank you for your kind attention. And please feel free to reach out anytime in case you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was Christian Walder. Christian will be joining us online for the Q&A later on. Now I would like to call Professor Priyam Das from the University of Hawaii, also one of the authors of one of the chapters in the book. Priya?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm presenting today on behalf of my co-authors, Lakpa Sherpa, who is with UNDP Nepal, and Ashok Das, who is my colleague at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our chapter is entitled Enabling Urban Resilience, Basic Services, Informality, and Livelihoods. I think I need to take my mask off. Okay, so the next slide, please. So the central thesis that we begin with in this chapter is that in most of the global south, where the world's urban poor live, access to basic infrastructure and services is still the backbone of urban resilience. And here we define urban resilience very broadly as the ability for cities, their populations, enterprises, as well as the systems they depend upon to be able to adapt and transform and cope with stresses and shocks. The other premise of our chapter is that climate proofing is essential, but at the same time in the global south, climate proofing is also about strengthening existing networks that promote routine health, safety, and well-being in normal times and not necessarily only before or after disasters happen. Next slide, please. So we situate our, theoretically, we situate our research within the broader literature on urban resilience and informality. So here there's a lot that's been written, some more recently, about how unequal access to infrastructure and services can really impact generational poverty. So that's something we really need to keep in mind. We also like to highlight that it's important to ask why physical infrastructure in our cities is lacking and why it is important to protect that from the impact of a changing climate. But we also like to highlight here that it's important to also ask about who is being impacted and how. And that's a question that we kind of put at the forefront of our research. And the third piece that we refer to is about successful upgrading, having a solid foundation that's based on trust between local governments as well as informal settlement residents, which is really critical, as well as leveraging synergies among state, community, and civil society actors. So that's kind of broadly where we situate our research. Next slide, please. So we did most of our research in Nepal during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as Ashok mentioned earlier, it was really difficult to collect data during the pandemic. And this was done between June and August of 2021 amidst like severe lockdowns and restrictions. And so despite the limitations, we were able to conduct a household survey with the help, of course, of a local NGO called the Nepal Mahila Ekta Samaj. And we also conducted a few interviews with civil society organization representatives as well. So in terms of the results, and you can read about in more detail about the study in the book chapter, but I just wanted to highlight some of the findings from that. Of course, the findings are not unexpected. We are all familiar with how the impacts have been on during the COVID-19 pandemic on poor households in particular. But then what the study did was it served to really highlight and reiterate the importance of just basic services like water, sanitation, wastewater management in these settlements, in these informal settlements that we studied. So some of the findings highlight that households were unable to comply with safety protocols because they were relying on self-provided water supply. In many cases, they had difficult living arrangements with almost 5 people living in 2+ rooms. There was obviously the impact of multiple insecurities, not just job loss, but also food insecurity, which some of my other colleagues will talk about, as well as not being able to self-provide because of job loss, not being able to access clean and reliable water supply as well. And of course, education suffered as well. Children were not able to attend online classes given the deep digital divide, as well as the difficulty for families to recharge their smartphones and so on. In terms of responses, the government made a concerted effort to raise awareness through different educational programs, as well as the distribution of food and non-food packages. But I think a lot from our research, what we're seeing is that a lot of the load was borne by civil society organizations that really propped up the poor households by supporting them in terms of setting up child learning centers or even building isolation wards and so on. So they played a key role in all of this. Next slide, please. So the three key takeaways that I would like to leave you with. One is that we see that physical infrastructure is really important for us. Physical infrastructure is really important, as the pandemic has shown us, but this definitely needs to be supplemented with what we call social infrastructure, which is support for health, education, and livelihoods, because those two are intricately connected. So projects addressing basic infrastructure and services will need to be much more comprehensive in their approach. Secondly, effective partnerships are definitely salient. Local governments are being saddled with an expanded mandate, particularly now as we see an increase in the frequency of extreme events. And so seeking out relevant partnerships with civil society organizations can be really productive, as our case study in Nepal has shown. Strengthening the capacity of local planning institutions also means preparing the next generation of urban planners, which is really important. And there, I would like to highlight that having a well-rounded understanding of the many dimensions of informality, not just the spatial one, which a lot of planning programs tend to focus on, is really going to be central. And lastly, the dearth of data presents innumerable challenges in addressing the persistent problems in informal settlements, which again necessitates collaboration between governments and grassroots organizations that are embedded within the communities to gather data and develop repositories. And in the book, we mentioned some examples, for instance, like the Urban Resource Center in Karachi, Pakistan, which is doing a great job in gathering data at the grassroots level and using that for advocacy in support of informal settlements. Those are just some of the highlights. I hope you will all have a chance to read the chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priyam. We will have you also in front later on during the question and answer portion. So I'd like to play a presentation from our colleague from the Asian Development Bank Institute, Peter Morgan.
Pandemic. The title of our paper is FinTech, Government Aid, and Informal Household Businesses in ASEAN Economies During the Pandemic. This is joint work with my colleagues Long Q Trin and Kun Hui Kim, also at ADBI. I will give an introduction, discuss the objectives and significance, talk about the data from our ADBI household survey in 7 ASEAN countries, the sample characteristics, methodology, empirical results, and conclusions. Informal firms typically have difficulty to access credit due to information asymmetry, lack of credit history, small size, and lack of collateral. However, the rapid diffusion of mobile phones and other devices is proving to be a game changer, making it much easier for poor households and informal firms to access financial services, including payments, credit, deposits, and insurance. We take advantage of a large survey of households in 7 ASEAN economies conducted by ADB to measure the impacts and responses related to the COVID-19 pandemic, including 1,100 observations of urban households with service businesses. The survey contains detailed data on the impacts of the pandemic on income, employment, experience of financial difficulty, and fintech usage. The survey was conducted in Cambodia, Indonesia, the Lao PDR, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. It was implemented from the end of January and finished by the end of March 2021. And the methodology was computer-assisted telephone interview because of the difficulty of in-person interviews because of COVID-19, and the coverage was nationally representative. The sampling method was random selection, and we had 1,000 households per country, both urban and rural. And of these, roughly 1,100 urban households overall reported having household businesses. The survey collected information on household characteristics, urban versus rural, the household head's gender, age, education, sources of income by sector and household size, the business status, whether it continued to operate, and revenue changes due to COVID-19, the receipt of government and other aid, business coping strategies, and use of fintech products and services. This table shows the breakdown of the sample by sector and by country. We can see that somewhat over half of the sample was in the retail wholesale sector. This was followed then by restaurants, hotels, and also personal services. This next slide shows the responses to the question, do you use any fintech services? And this is divided by formal and informal firms. And interestingly, the share of informal firms reported using fintech services is quite large in many of the countries, in some cases higher than that of formal firms. So that suggests that it's actually relatively easy for informal firms to access fintech services. This slide shows the 2 equations that we estimated. The first is for the status of the company, that is whether or not it continued to operate after the pandemic. And then the second variable is revenues, that is whether the revenues increased, were unchanged, or decreased during the pandemic period. The variables of interest are whether or not the firm was informal or urban, whether it used fintech services, whether it received government aid, and some interaction terms. The control variables included household head characteristics, the business sector, size of family, and country fixed effects. This slide shows the results for the first equation on business status. So equations 1 and 4 are for those firms that continued business, 2 and 5 are for those which temporarily closed, and 3 is for, and 6 are for those which permanently closed. And we find that usage of fintech is positively associated with the continuation of firms' business activities and negatively associated with those who either temporarily or permanently close. So this is not quite a causal argument, but it does suggest that there is a correlation between the usage of fintech services and the continuation of the business during the pandemic period. This slide shows the estimation results for the second equation on revenue change. So again, we have 3 equations, increase, no change, and decrease in sales. And we find that urban informal firms and urban firms that used fintech were more likely to see an increase in sales and less likely to see a decrease in sales. So again, this points to a positive correlation between the use of fintech and improvement in sales during the pandemic period. In conclusion, we think that the database has a good sample of formal and informal urban households running household service businesses. We had a sample of 1,100 households spread fairly evenly over 7 ASEAN countries and detailed information on the impacts of COVID-19. The results showed that a surprisingly large share of informal firms could use fintech services, especially in e-commerce, and use of fintech was positively associated with business continuation and urban firms using fintech were more likely to see revenue increases and less likely to see revenue declines. So these correlations do not necessarily imply causality, but they are suggestive of a positive relationship. And I think the implications are that these results should strengthen the case for policies to promote fintech innovation, fintech inclusion, and digital financial literacy, including for firms in urban areas. Thanks very much. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. That was Peter Morgan. Last but not the least, we call on our colleague from the Food and Agriculture Organization, John Taylor.
Greetings, selamat sore, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present here. I would like to congratulate Chairman Bambang Susantono, also Professor Ashok Das, to ADB and the ADB Institute for the launch of the book, and also congratulate all the colleagues who are presenting here. I'm presenting research conducted together with Ashok Das, Saiful Momin, and Janet Nako, and the chapter is entitled Nourishment at the Margins of a Megacity: How the Poor Eat in Dhaka, Bangladesh. This chapter shines light on how the urban poor are able to nourish themselves with sufficient nutritious food in the context of an Asian megacity, being Dhaka, Bangladesh. The main finding is that the poor struggle to meet their nutritional needs due to a combination of factors related to urban life. This reveals a puzzling paradox that while cities offer more plentiful food than rural communities, which many of the urban poor come from, the quality of diets is worse, and while food is more available, it is not necessarily more accessible, particularly for the urban poor. And during COVID-19 pandemic, its availability became a matter of critical importance. Next slide, please. This chapter explores some of the issues that influence the poor's access and the impacts of COVID on them. Of 5 major issues, the first being that the most vulnerable of the poor are those worst affected by crises such as COVID, but also crises such as family emergencies, and this reduces their nutritional intake. For example, some coping strategies are reducing from 3 to 1 meal a day, not eating protein, and is just eating starchy, low-quality food. And often it is women, children, and the elderly who make way for others. Next slide, please. Where one lives and works affects one's access to food, so those living further away from markets are worst affected and have to rely on informal markets, which may offer inferior quality food and lower food safety standards, or on informal vendors who sell smaller amounts of foods but generally at higher prices. During the pandemic, an interest in informal sources of food, such as urban gardening, rose as a way of supplementing access to nutritious food. Thirdly, the low and regular incomes of the urban poor, largely working in informal sector, leads to food insecurity due to high costs of living. The poor can spend up to 50% of their incomes on food, trumping all other expenses. And during the COVID pandemic, this is one of the expenditures that is often the first to be sacrificed. Next slide, please. Preparing nutritious and healthy food is difficult in small, cramped conditions where the urban poor live. Lack of access to basic services such as drinking water, sanitation, and having to share kitchens, often without any storage capacity or refrigeration, restricts the ability to eat safe and nutritious food. Next slide, please. Another issue being that government actions and their relationships with the poor matters during times of crises. Where relationships of trust and communication exist between local levels of government, NGOs, community-based organizations, this has helped relief distribution of food to be more effective and has saved lives. So some final lessons about this topic. Firstly, nutrition-related interventions are very much needed. This means infrastructural upgrades, improving access to basic services, and social protection measures that can ensure nutrition, access, and awareness. Secondly, but this should not be confined to just food system planning. Urban planning needs to be more informed and concerned about food security issues. So attention to, for example, the location of markets, the existence of farmers markets that may fill in gaps in the city, and access to land for urban gardening or agriculture, and being able to address issues of food security at different scales, different dimensions, and different time horizons is necessary. And thirdly, good governance and administrative decentralization are essential to empower the poor to enhance food security. Examples such as urban food councils, city food charters, and good access to information and communication have enabled the food system to better provide for all, especially during times like the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now we go to the question and answer. This is the opportunity for everyone to ask their questions. I would like to request Professor Ashok Das, Chairman Pak Bambang, sir, Joris Van Etten, and Professor Priyam Das to please come and take your seat in front. Thank you. And while they are doing that, I would like to remind the audience to, when you ask questions, please identify yourself, identify your identification, your affiliation, I'm so sorry, and then ask your brief question. We have a couple of minutes, around 20 minutes. And then so we have here already the gentleman, sir.
Yeah, right to start the discussion. Bobby Setiawan from Gajah Mada University. First, of course, congratulations for this very interesting, important books. And it should be a tradition for the executive at the work ADB to compile so many lessons into a book that can be shared to other publics. Yeah, so hopefully in Indonesian context, this will be amal jariah. Yeah? Give you a long blessing. Yeah. Second, not really question, but Pak Bambang know that this morning we were discussing on the IKN, and one topic's very important one is informality and social inclusion. There was some debate on the impacts of IKN to informality, but seems to be most participants agree that informality is something which is inevitable. Yeah, and in that context, then we have to prepare at least two measures. One is a preventive measure, and second, curative measure. Maybe not really question, but I like to have your response, especially since you are now in the very important position of, realizing that Indonesian dream, the IKN. I don't know whether you have some thought on that, especially preventive measure on informality in the development of IKN. Thank you very much.
I think there is a question, so Professor Bobby, you asked me to respond. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think the informality is inevitable, especially on the developing countries context. And as we see around the world, on one hand, looks like that this is the informal sector is treated as equal to informal settlement, but they are not. That's two different things. Yeah. On the other hand, this is a sector which can be acting as a social protections during the crisis, and we witness that from time to time, right? So there are two sides of a coin that we can see from the informal sector, and we have to do our best to know better how the dynamics in this sector is working. So for me, in the IKN Nusantara, the new capital, of course, we are very committed to have the inclusivity, because the Nusantara will have 5 features, characteristics. One is green, including the climate change. We do hope that we can have the locally determined contributions for this Nusantara. This is something new, not only the national determined contribution, but the local determined contribution. And my colleague on my right side here is also helping us to do that one. He promised to deliver that one perhaps in the next COP27 in Egypt. So we are going to announce as the first city in Indonesia that has a locally determined contribution for the climate change. Second one is on the smart, right? There is some discussion on the digital technology on how they help the informal sector to be more productive. Yeah. There is ibu-ibu and emak-emak in the Nusantara area right now that we train to have a digital literacy. Before, perhaps they are only selling a small kue bakery, but it's very modest one. But now with the training, they can take a picture with this one, put it on the website, and they can get an order, and their sales is going up. And keep in mind that next year we are going to have at least 100,000 workers working in Nusantara. This is a new things that demonstrate by having a good digital technology, we can transform the informal sector into something that is more productive. But the third after the green smart is inclusiveness. So for us, we are really committed to have that one. We don't know at this time whether there will be some informality on Nusantara or not. We do our best to have all formal, but time will tell us about that one. And this is an area for many of you who are professors also to have a research on that. But for us, on the policy side, at least three things. One, we commit on the inclusiveness. Second one, we commit on the interconnectedness among sectors, among teams. So we cannot isolate this as a one sector or one policy on the economy, on the political thing or the social thing. We have to do all the thing all together. And the third one is innovations. So 3I, inclusive, interconnectedness, and innovations. Because I can, as I told you before, with the digital technology, there is some area that we can also help or assist the informal sector to be more productive. So that's my response to you, Professor Bobby. Thank you. Any other colleagues would like to help me? No?
Okay, thank you so much. First, I would like to say thanks for inviting me here. I just want to discuss about services in the new capital city of Indonesia. If you talk about divisions, we know that smart, green, etc. But I never hear about health, environment, safety, security, and quality. So how to manage this? Because now I with my friend in Balikpapan try to prepare about how to make our society there health, environment, safety, security, and quality of life. Only that. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Isradi, Director of Balikpapan University. I 1000% agree with you that to some extent, this is my personal views on how the urban planner, take a city in more sort of like infrastructure, economic, and less on the health and education way, right? If I may be biased, but it looks like to me that if we do some urban plan and management, we tend to not put health, education, and social protection all together with the infrastructure, for example, or with all the economic infrastructure. So for me, the COVID-19 opens up a Pandora box that reveal that we should put more on the social sectors. That's for sure. How we can integrate, for example, the education facilities, how we integrate, for example, the health facilities that is very accessible, not only for those who has money or the haves, but to those who are on the bottom of the society also. They must be able in the difficult situations, access this kind of basic services. And that's include health, education, and social protections. In the past, we tend not to put this one as a dominant part of the planning process. But nowadays, I believe that every city has to make that one on top on the list, because without health, we cannot do anything. Yeah. We can have a good infrastructure, we can have a modern building, we can have a good, for example, advanced technology, but at the end of the day, health is the basic thing that every human has to have that one. Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you, and I think for us in planning, urban planning, city planning, urban managers, we want to have that kind of things integrated as part of the comprehensive planning policies, and also a holistic approach to have a good planning and also a good, the action plan to be there. If again, there is another pandemic coming to the cities, because at the end of the day, cities is the engine of the economic growth. If city is not healthy, then perhaps 80% or that kind of proportion of the economic growth will be affected because the city's condition is not healthy. That's my take. Ashok.
Oh, yeah, sure. So to add to what was said before is, I think as urban planners, when we do city planning, citywide planning, and we come up with master plans, we have to be more upfront about addressing informal settlements, because most of the times master plans are silent about what is going to happen to informal settlements. They are focused more on planning satellite cities and redistributing population and services. But I think it's important to really put informal settlements front and center. And one of the ways in which that can be done is also to really look at decoupling service provision from legal status. So irrespective of legal status, providing services should be prioritized, and that kind of addresses the health issue. If we're really concerned about the health issue, then we need to look at it from that perspective of decoupling service provision from legal status. So I just wanted to.
Pak Rector, one more thing. I mean, Pak Bambang talked about health, but there's another H word, which is, I think, very directly related to health, which is happiness. When we meet each other, the first question is always, how are you? How's your health? And so on. So the happiness of people living in cities in Asia and the Pacific is, I think, directly related to their well-being, their health. So for us to help create cities which give space for people to be healthy is extremely important. And I think we saw that directly during the COVID pandemic, where all of a sudden the number of foldable bike sales in Jakarta went through the roof, where we saw in Paris bikers take over the streets which were from normally used by cars. In Barcelona, where you have these super blocks. So Pak Bambang and his team, of course, have a huge challenge, but also a massive opportunity to put health at the center of the design of the capital, the new capital, because the moment that your children are able to play, that your parents, that your elderly people are able to go for a walk safely, that of course also creates an environment where people are happy to actually move to that capital. Because the last thing, of course, what we want is a capital just full of civil servants who are doing hard work there, but there's no dynamic. There's not a city where, so creating that space for health and happiness to come together, I think, is a very important element. So thanks for that question.
John, do you want to say something?
No, it's okay. I'll wait for another opportunity.
All right. So I just wanted to mention two things. I mean, in relation to even the first question and this one. like you said, Babobi, informality is inevitable. There have been capital projects before. I mean, Chandigarh in India, Brasilia, none of them wanted informality. None of them thought there will be informal settlements. All of them had informality. And today they are quite livable and exciting places precisely because of the maturity of how the informal sector has matured in a way over time. It takes time to notice and recognize that. So that's one point. So I think there has to be so even with master planning, I think one of the very essential elements, in my opinion, is that there has to be flexibility as much as you want certainty and sort of very clear ideas about what's going to go where. One has to be humble enough to recognize that it will change probably. So element of flexibility built into master planning itself. Also, let's say, keeping aside, areas or lands where I won't call them informal or illegal or slums, but where spontaneous shelter could be allowed to come up, for example, as and when the need arises. But more importantly, I think the design should be very compact. It should go above conventional FARs and densities so that the burden of commuting and traveling and accessing services is minimized for the poorest people. So in general, I think all housing should have inclusionary housing clauses in them. We should think radically outside the box, whereby maybe official facilities, etc., should be designed to also provide housing, especially for the lower segment of workers, if not for the, I don't recommend it for higher segment because for them getting across and around is easier. So those are some very, I think, radical, radically different ideas, I think, that can be pursued. That's one thing. In regard to the health, security, and safety, we don't have the answers. The answers will come from the communities themselves. So it's very important to involve the community, to ask them what are their needs in terms of health and security, and to involve them in the co-production of the services. And that's where we are emphasizing that communities themselves, civil society organizations, it's very important to promote a healthy civil society. And that, I think, is partly very, important for the backbone of the city in a way. So the state does not need to take on all the responsibility, neither should all the responsibility be left to the market. There is much more scope for co-production if we think of this far ahead and act sort of smartly in a way. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Ashok. I'm sorry, sir. We have room for 2 more questions, and we have just a second. We have a question from online. This is from Constantina Sorelli from UCLA. All right. So would you like to speak, Constantina? Or would you like me to read your question? Okay. So perhaps I will read her question. She has poor connection. Okay. So she said that given your findings and global developments during the pandemic, what connections could be drawn between residents' experiences with informality, the responses, and the planning interventions during COVID-19 across urban contexts? For example, across cities that are commonly considered as cities of the global South and North. So, Priyam, Ashok? Yes. What connections could you draw between the residents' experiences with informality, the responses, and planning interventions during COVID-19? Are there connections that you could draw between informality, the responses, and the planning interventions, please? Short answer.
So I think the similar, okay, and so this is very, this took us by surprise because she's an old colleague and she's posed this is a communication after like 15 years, maybe out of the blue. So, so anyway, so didn't even know she was joining. Anyway, so thank you, Constantina. Yes, there are similarities. I think society realized that it is very important, in a way that your society is as healthy or as robust and as resilient as the weakest link. So this has been realized everywhere. Some contexts, some places were better sort of poised to respond very immediately. Others took time, but everybody responded. I would say this is the commonality. In many cases, I mean, in the developed countries, I think the global north, the response mostly came from the state. And that was mainly because I think they had the finances to do so. And in the developing countries, the states have tried, but it was definitely inadequate. But even before the state could react or act, civil society mobilized itself into action in the worst hit countries in the global south. This is another piece of evidence which says that we need to proactively think of involving civil society actors in the regular planning and management. That is the lesson that, so what I'm saying is the response in many of the developing countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, South Asia, did not come at the behest of the state. This was completely self-generated, and it was amazing. And this has also been witnessed time and again in the case of disasters, etc., where the state machinery is not in order. So that's my thing. So that's the difference, you know, that it was more from civil society in developing countries, I think, at least in the beginning, whereas civil society compared to the state played a smaller role in the developed countries.
Okay, thank you very much. Last two questions, very quick, please. Yes, the gentleman there and the gentleman over here. Please, sir, identify yourself and your affiliation and your very quick question.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate to Pak Bambang. I'm Radif Khatami from University of Juanda Bogor with Pak Martin. Regarding the urban planning, there should be a problem with the migrant or worker migrant to this site. And the other problem that our research on land, I would ask about how to give a solution with the urban planning with land bank, for example, because our research about land bank. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And then I'll pass on to you.
My name is Tathagat Chatterjee from XIM University, Bhubaneswar, India. It's an excellent book. Looking forward to the book. And my question is, it's very interesting to note that you talked about the gender dimension in informality. Informality is not a homogeneous thing. There are different layers within informality. It's very interesting that you talked about the gender dimension. But could you talk, I mean, how that can inform urban planning in the future direction?
I think that question would be better answered.
Okay, so sir, the first question is for you, and the second question is for John.
Yeah, so the first question related to the issue of migrants and the possibility, the opportunity of land banking. Yeah, I think you know, having myself moved around from city to city over the last 20 years in the Asia region, to some extent, migration is here to stay. Yeah? And migration is a very powerful tool for the better also, because it helps us to develop, it helps to diversify communities, it helps to bring new ideas, it helps to really complement communities. At the same time, it's of course a topic which also in the West is quite under debate. How do you accommodate massive influx of people? How do you ensure that there's sufficient economic opportunities there? Again, the informal sector, of course, provides a massive cushion of resilience to some of the shocks and stresses when migrants come in. But I think this topic of how cities change and the dynamic of cities change is something, a number of the elements in the book talk about that. And innovative tools, including land banking, I think are really necessary to, for example, in informal settlements, to, as we've seen in the example in Indonesia, to try and regulate together with the communities, of course, to try and ensure that that the areas where the people are living is indeed safer, more accessible, better provided with basic services and so on. So I think that's definitely an important topic. Thanks.
Yeah, just a very quick. So I think to answer, we also need to change the way we look at this. In fact, the problem is that we consider it a problem. You see, so that needs to change. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of research, new research on migration, which is actually showing that this idea that it is just rural to urban, it's one way, it's permanent, does not have any empirical basis actually. So this is a legacy of how migration studies were done in the 50s and the 60s, and it still continues. Migration today is increasingly strategic, cyclical, seasonal, more so in Indonesia than in many other countries. And in fact, there is very fascinating work which is coming out of new research, say, for example, in India, which is showing that there are places which are urbanizing, which is called in situ urbanization without any migration. In fact, without migration, and there is also, so it's not as simple. So we need to, the second thing is this idea of legality versus illegality, that there are deserving migrants versus undeserving. I mean, we have to get out of this binary thinking. That's one of the messages we are very emphatically sort of trying to convey in the book. And so these are the practices. This is what I meant by processes, that processes of dealing with these challenges. So let's look at it as a marriage, for example, or as raising children. I mean, it's challenging, but you don't call your children problematic or problems, or you don't call your spouse a problem. It's challenging, right? So let's look at everyone who belongs in a family, the urban family, and let's not call anybody in the urban family as problem. In fact, without in the informal sector, the formal cannot exist. That's, I think, the basic message that's coming out of this. Yeah. So
John, please.
Yeah. Thank you. So you're right to note that it is, in terms of gender, the experience of the urban poor is in no way homogeneous, and I think that there is a burden of responsibility upon women, which is often is not recognized. Women often are at work during the day and then have a whole additional set of expectations placed upon them, and this makes them more vulnerable. In the case, for example, of food security, often sacrificing their own nutrition for those of others. So I think what's important there is to understand that the vulnerability that women and others in families, that there is a difference there, that kind of needs more awareness and certain social protection mechanisms or different allocation of time and resources is necessary to ensure that that balance is struck. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That concludes our Q&A portion. Before I hand over to Director Lele, I'd just like to announce that after our event, Chairman Bangbang will stay over, and the media is invited to stay and field his questions to him for a short time. So after this event, Pak Bambang will stay and entertain a few of your questions. All right, and don't forget, our books are available in the booth. The PDF you can download using the QR code as well. And there are some goodie bags with ADB souvenirs available for you afterwards. So I'll pass it on to Lele. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have reached the end of the seminar, but the debate continues. So we congratulate the authors and the editors for giving us such an important volume of the chapters, contributing to the debate, discussion, and stimulating the debate. I think we have a very rich discussion. So thanks again. And thank you very much for joining us for this event. Also, we thank our online audience, although we cannot see them. Yeah, thank you very much for joining and join the discussion. So thank you very much. And please enjoy your rest of the day. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye. Whether this is really your drawing. This is a sketch by Ashok Das on the cover. Thank you.